this is actually my last talk for this week, and it's on a bit of an unusual topic. So we are used to hearing the, construct AI for social good, but hardly anyone has spoken about AI acts for social good. And when Michaela, half in jest, suggested that I should maybe talk about the AI act for social good, I actually embraced the idea and said, yeah, that would be amazing, because what does that even mean? And I had to actually figure out, okay, now we have a catchy topic, but what am I actually going to say? And I figured that what made most sense for me to say is to scan through the AI Act and figure out what incentives there are for AI providers, deployers, and users to actually adopt, develop, deploy, and use AI for social good. So my main question is whether the AI Act contains sufficient incentives for these stakeholders to develop AI in a way that truly benefits society. And that's why the talk has a subtitle. And the subtitle reads, Brussels, we have a risk obsession problem. And I think that's the case, and I'm going to hopefully prove it to you that we do have a risk obsession problem. Because the more you read the AI Act, and I've already been reading it since it was first proposed by the Commission some 2.5 years ago, up until the actual final text that was adopted in July of this year. I think that the AI Act focuses too much on risk regulation and too little on actually offering mitigation measures for the risks that are identified. So the AI Act is surgically precise in pinpointing the issues that might arise with the deployment of AI systems and development. Whether they are real or perceived, that's a different story, but the risks are there, well categorized into categories of high risks, AI systems, prohibited practices, and so on and so forth. So this is very well defined. But when it comes to mitigation measures, you actually start seeing constructs that actually don't make much sense and that people can't really implement in practice. So read, for example, Article 10, which explains how people should be doing proper data management, and talk to any data officer within any company and ask them, how exactly are you planning to implement Article 10? And they will tell you, I have no clue. Because the way these provisions are written, the way the mitigation measures are written, are actually poor and create little incentive for companies to comply with these instruments. So to me, first of all, the AI Act started as a fundamental rights piece of legislation, so fundamental rights were at the core. And then little by little, even though if you read the recitals of the regulation, you would see that fundamental rights feature every now and then. But in essence, what is the AI Act? The AI Act is a product safety legislation, much like the ones that we have for cars, much like the ones that we have for aircraft and generally for defective products. So it's just domain specific, but it's a product safety legislation. And as such, fundamental rights had to take the backseat in favor of rules that aim to control how you place goods and services on the market related to AI. To me, this is manifested across the AI Act in requirements such as classification of general purpose AI models as models posing systemic risks based solely on the requirements of how much compute they require. So there are quantitative requirements in the AI Act such as 10 to the 25 to the power of 25 floating operations per second, which was a criterion, a quantitative criterion that was superseded the instance it was introduced, because now most of the models that we have on the market actually exceed this quantitative criterion. So does that mean that every single general purpose AI model that is currently on the market poses a systemic risk? Of course not. But this goes to show you that these sort of quantitative requirements introduced in legislation don't make sense. These sort of requirements have a place in standards, but standards are not developed by regulators. So what are some examples from across the world of what we might call AI for social good? So McKinsey compiled a library of around 160 AI social impact use cases, and these are actually their words. They say these aren't just theoretical musing, they're practical scenarios where AI could be leveraged for the greater good. And all of them align with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Real life examples like startups working on diagnosing cancer, to helping blind folks navigate their surroundings, to identifying victims of online sexual exploitation, to aiding disaster relief efforts, to dealing with disinformation, and so on and so forth. So the examples are out there. We have starting companies building this. But are these companies actually enabled by regulation or not? The domain of social impact of these initiatives spans really areas ranging from crisis response all the way down to climate change or global warming, as Monsieur Caillot said this morning, and poverty indeed. So if you do a horizon scanning of the initiatives that exist out there, you would notice probably that the majority of these initiatives actually originate from the US. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. Companies like Microsoft and Google have indeed been pouring a lot of resources into building AI for social good. There is a link in this video. I'm not going to play the video for you, but Juan La Vista Ferez is the chief data scientist at Microsoft, and he's been at the forefront of Microsoft Research AI for Good Lab, where they have really initiatives such as focusing on fundamental rights, on expanding opportunities for people, on advancing sustainability. And there are true initiatives. Behind each of these categories, there are real projects that exist. For example, Microsoft Research have been running a project called Data Sheets for Datasets, which of course we also recognize as related to our Just Data Annotation initiative. We are running, and we are liaising with these efforts, and of course incorporating the good practices that they embed. But really, there are actual efforts of these companies. Same goes for Google. Google AI and Social Good. You would see, I will not again play these. There are videos that really explain very well what they're doing. But the Google's Open Health Stack is a wonderful suite of tools that allows companies to really build for social good, and applying AI to make a difference in the lives of those who need it most. So I think you may call me naive, but I actually believe that these initiatives are in earnest, and that these companies truly want, as part of their journey, as obviously commercial entities operating in a competitive market with shareholders that expect revenues and dividends at the end of each year. I still believe that these efforts on AI for social good are genuine. The World Economic Forum has also been discussing quite extensively the question of impactful AI and of AI for social good, and they say that AI only has the potential to transform society, but if regulated. So they seem to link, in a way, not directly perhaps, but indirectly, using AI for social good with some form of regulation. So to make sure that we have a baseline, we have some baseline principles that prohibit certain practices, like what we indeed did with the AI Act. Yes, if you ask me, the practices that we currently have in the AI Act as prohibited actually make sense, like practices for, that relate, for example, to abusive emotion detection and profiling of people. Of course, nobody wants that. Nobody wants AI for that. They are clearly maleficent uses of AI. But that's not where the problem is. We can almost always pinpoint with precision the cases that are at both ends of the spectrum. So we know cases that are clearly addressing the social good, and we know cases that are clearly harmful to society. The problem is if you want to put a case that doesn't necessarily fit into either of these categories at the two ends of the spectrum. So if you want to operate along the spectrum, where exactly do you put this? So is it more beneficial or more harmful? This is a criterion that I don't think a legislator should be doing, and this is something that should actually be left to courts, because that's what they're called for, and that's why they exist. And if we try to set this in advance, we are actually setting up ourselves for a disaster. Now, something I did not cover, but that's very important to me. How can we support AI for social good? And how can regulation support this? Like I said, most of the initiatives on on AI for social good that we know currently originate from the US. Do you think that the US has supported these companies through any regulatory measures? Not really. What you see here is a very fine collection of examples of startups funded by through this MIT Solve Challenge, with actually a combination of public and private funding, but mostly private funding. That goes in the figures such as 1.25 million for really technologies that are prototypes. I mean, if you read the interviews with these people, you would figure out that they don't have really commercial grade solutions yet. They've just prototyped something and they got funding to do this. So somebody took the risk of actually funding these companies to do that, which is an approach we don't really have in the EU. EU is extremely risk averse. We don't have a similar concept of risk capital. Even the things we call risk capital usually come with a lot of red tape and heavy administrative burden, which is, of course, dissuades most companies from engaging. Just let me give you an example. 2 years ago, I had the chance to engage with very fine German startup working on synthetic data pipelines. I wanted to involve them in a very interesting research project funded by the EU. And they were fully on board. But at the end of the conversation, they called me privately and they said, look, I really love the idea. We are fully committed to do this. But we really don't have the resources to deal with the bureaucracy and the red tape that this would put on us by engaging with you in a consortium. So we are happy to help, but we don't want to be formally associated with the project because it's too burdensome on us. We have a business to run. And if somebody wants to give us money, they have to accept that there is a certain risk. That indeed we have, I think we have to change this culture, and there should be incentives in legislation, that some enterprises might fail, and that's okay, because we need to give this money, we need to allocate this risk capital and give it to these enterprises with the idea that yes, some of them will fail, and that's okay, because we will then know what works and what doesn't work. We don't have anything like that. So where is Europe, or more specifically the EU, in all this? And now we're just talking the talk, but not walking the walk. I did a quick search of how many times social is mentioned in the AI Act, and you will see it's mentioned roughly 34 times. And I have taken some excerpts from these passages where social good is mentioned, or rather social. So you can see that these are all coming, most of them, actually all of them are coming from the recitals. And by the way, for the non-lawyers, the recitals in the regulation are typically not binding. They serve when you need to interpret the regulation, but they're not binding. So a court cannot apply a recital. A court can read the recital and say, okay, that's probably what the legislator had in mind, but it's not binding. So here we say, use of AI can help provide key competitive advantages to undertakings and support socially and environmentally beneficial outcomes. I mean, these sort of things that you would expect to see anywhere in a regulation like this. And you see they give examples of positive beneficial outcomes such as in healthcare, in agriculture, food safety, and all the usual suspects that we're used to anyway. Social and environmental well-being, and this is where it gets interesting. So you will notice that in many instances in the regulation, the legislator uses language that is dubious, to say the least. Like, the regulation is literally full of these, also in the binding provisions or in the actual articles of the regulation. You will very often see the application should be of those principles should be translated when possible in the design and use of AI models. Stakeholders are encouraged as appropriate. Then you see member states are encouraged where appropriate, and so on. It's full of this. Who is making the decision of whether something is appropriate, when it is appropriate, and when it isn't? So if you ask me, this is nothing more than wishful thinking that we have in the AI Act. And I don't think any of these measures, and you can see here that there's a strong reference. I know that if anybody from the European Commission is listening to us, will probably not be happy with that. But what I'm saying here is that you can't just say that by allocating sufficient resources, including public and union funding, and where appropriate and provided that the eligibility and selection criteria are fulfilled, considering in particular project which pursue such objectives. This means nothing. I mean, it's literally the case of that German startup I told you about. Most private enterprises that are trying to run a business would react to this with, I can't be bothered. Too much red tape. Don't have time for this. And I've had, in my practice, I've had clients whom I've suggested, maybe you should consider public funding from the EU. And they say, yeah, we would love to do that. And it obviously should make our lives easier. But no, thanks. So, is this enough? I think the answer is clear that it's not enough. I think that public funding alone cannot incentivize building applications for social good. I don't think there are actually any incentives, true incentives in the AI Act for building applications for social good, because the AI Act is essentially product legislation. They're virtually non-existent. Risk management is focused on risk, yes, but we also need to think about the opportunities, and the opportunities are simply not there. I'm not saying that it's up only for the AI Act to do this, but if anything, the AI Act should have at least laid some foundations for this, and these foundations are nowhere to be found. Quantitative requirements like the compute requirements that I mentioned for general purpose AI models are an extremely poor way of drafting legislation anyway, because they don't belong in legislation. Legislation is abstract on a purpose, because it needs to serve a lot of use cases that might sometimes be outliers. If you can't catch these, then you are making case-specific legislation. And case-specific legislation is essentially case law. It's what courts should be doing and not legislators. And now, lastly, this was published yesterday. So this is a slide that I added this morning. The UN published, I should say, I'm really happy with the report that they did on governing AI for humanity. And they make an excellent proposition, which of course, again, some might say is wishful thinking, but at least it's really concrete. So they say we should really establish a global fund for AI, where the creation of a global fund for AI to put a floor under the AI divide, managed by an independent governance structure. The fund would receive financial and in-kind contributions from public and private sources and disperse them, including via the capacity development network, to facilitate access to AI enablers. And they give examples, specific examples of what needs to be done. And this is nowhere to be found in the AI Act, except maybe for the sandboxes, which is a topic for a different session, because the sandboxes themselves are so messed up in the AI Act. But they refer to shared computing resources for model training and fine-tuning, sandboxes and benchmarking and testing tools to actually provide environments for companies to test these products, to see if they are aligned with the requirements, and also to inform public policy making. Governance, safety, and interoperability solutions, data sets, and research into how data sets and models could be combined for SDG-related projects. Again, nowhere to be found in the AI Act. And finally, a repository of AI models and curated data sets for the SDGs. This is regulation for social good, if such a thing can even exist. And this is what we don't have in the EU. So I'm sorry to end on a not so positive note, but my answer to whether the AI Act can serve for social good is categorically no. And it was probably never meant to be. But even if it were, it hasn't reached the target. Thanks a lot.